So, there's problems with housing, and some people are doing something about it. And some people are finding problems or creating problems, perhaps, arguably, that weren't there before. I'm neither here nor there. I do not take a specific policy position. I take a policy suggestion for when it comes to rent control, but there are a lot of places that in 2021 and 2022 enacted some restrictive housing policies, let's just say. And just to skim through, and then I will kind of comment on the position of the NMHC and the National Apartment Association on these rent control provisions. In California, voters approved to limit rent increases to 75% of the CPI. And they also lowered annual rent increases from 6% to 3% in Santa Monica. And in Richmond, which is a city north of Oakland, rent increases were limited to 3%. Okay, so that's California. In Maine, tenants' rights measure was approved, which limits annual rent increases to 70% of CPI, and a 90-day notice for lease termination, restrictions of security deposits to amount of 1 month's rent, and a prohibition on fees for applications, credit reports, and background checks. In Florida, there is in Orange County, which is the Orlando MSA, they have a planned ordinance which would prevent existing apartment owners from raising rents at a rate higher than the inflation rate for the region over the next year.
For new development or just in general?
I don't know the specifics. They didn't name the specific, whether it was new development or not.
You can't raise rents over inflation? CPI, that's the idea.
That seems like it, yes. Now, the Florida
that sounds like an idea a politician made up. Like, it makes sense, right? We'll just peg rents to inflation. That'll make housing work.
Well, that idea and Florida, that's not going to.
That's the whole reason why we were building and investing in housing, is to outpace inflation. So we're just not going to build any more housing or invest in any more housing.
Yeah. Well, maybe they had the best intentions.
Yeah, clearly.
The Florida Apartment Association. So notice I said planned ordinance and not enacted.
Yeah.
Because
what does that mean?
The Florida Apartment Association and the Florida Association of Realtors filed a lawsuit before the election to get the measure off the ballot, and the judge ruled that the suit could not proceed until after the election. Well, nearly 60% of voters approved the rent control ordinance, yet pending litigation has stopped the ordinance from going into effect. I think there's going to be continued opposition. We'll see how that plays out. I don't anticipate it going through, at least in this form. It's going to be drawn out.
But either way, whether it doesn't go through or it actually, if it doesn't go through, it's pretty close. Mm-hmm. And Orlando is different than the rest of Florida. But still, I mean, Florida's now a relatively conservative state. I mean, it's been purple for a long time. But that's definitely if you can't raise, if any type of limit on rent increases is a reason not to invest. There could still be reasons to invest. I know people invest in rent controlled apartments in New York City, but it's like, well, they like it because no one ever moves out. Yeah. And if they do, you can raise the rents quite a bit. You're not raising your rents, but it's relatively low risk.
And that's exactly the reason I think that the National Apartment Association and the NMHC posit for why they don't work, why these rent control are counterproductive. They say that rent control exacerbates housing strategies, housing shortages. It causes buildings to deteriorate, stunts new development, and can potentially lead to higher rents. They point to the ill effects of Minneapolis-St. Paul market as evidence. As a result of rent control laws, about $1 billion in multifamily projects were either put on hold or canceled. There's also a math.
That's with a B, billion.
Yeah, and that's just in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. We have seen Minneapolis rent. As its rent growth was anemic, probably because of its policies. One of the worst. But
I have to, between Minneapolis and San Francisco, I think Minneapolis is probably the worst performing market over the last few years.
Now, from a renter's perspective, though, that's great.
Yeah,
but if you look to the rent to income ratio, Minneapolis is not on the lower end.
Yeah, that's true. It was already expensive. And if you look at markets with rent control, it's not like there are cheap places to rent or to live.
Yeah.
It's the concept of focusing on symptoms rather than you know, core problems and focusing on solutions. Just
Yeah.
you know, it's like, you know, they're scratching the itch and they're wondering why it's getting worse,
Yeah.
not getting better.
And so this is one side of the argument, like you said, is like the kind of the Band-Aid side.
Yeah.
And it is very attractive. It is very, it seems reasonable from the perspective of a renter. Why I don't want my rent to raise. Why don't they just prevent it from being raised? And what I've seen and noticed in the past few years is an increasing amount of, you know, this is kind of rent control is kind of on a more democratic issue, a more Democrat issue. And I've seen an increasing amount of voices from the Biden administration itself. We saw a memo earlier this year talking about housing supply. It's talking about maybe don't solve this with restrictive things like rent control.
They did not want, even in, President Biden's memo from the White House, it was not rent control. It was more deregulation.
It was, yes, don't restrict. Let's make things more open and expansive.
I mean, it seems like there's and we were talking about this just before the show. It's that, you know, the Democrats are relatively split between more the ideologues and some of the pragmatists. And then on the Republican side, it's, you know, really don't want to do anything at all. But you'd think that there would be a lot of bipartisan support because we're talking about deregulation that's going to allow for more affordable housing. You know, that can be a market-based solution that, you know, seemingly the White House is behind. Seems like it could be a win-win.
Yeah, I think that we probably are seeing it, not necessarily from Republicans, but maybe from groups that are majority Republican members. Like, I'm guessing a lot of investors and developers of apartment buildings are Republican. Maybe some are Democrat, but some are Republican.
Sure, it's a mix. But
and they, you know, they're probably pro deregulation.
Yeah.